This week in my starter segment on the national parks, yes, they still have a website, so that's good. I have to say possibly the most important thing about the parks is they're still there. So everything you can do to vocally and physically support them at both the local and federal level can help them stay that way. And a fun way to support them is to go and visit your local one or plan a longer trip to visit something further afield. Consider looking in on something that's not on the tip of everyone's tongue. There are beautiful trails and trees and flowers and vistas and birds that don't top lists. But you're working with so much that's so spectacular, well, it's hard to make a bad pick. One of the most dependable things about the parks is there are so many birds, especially this time of year when they're busy building homes and attracting mates and getting ready for baby birds. And the birds that are there are likely ones you won't see anywhere else. America's parks do a huge amount of heavy lifting when it comes to providing habitat for resident and traveling birds. And you can find a park in your area that is a birding hotspot. Look up the Birds and Birding page at nps.gov. And while considering the entrance fee to national parks, consider the options. There's the regular annual pass for $80, which covers the entrance fee for a car full of people. At some parks, it's per individual, but if you're going to a place that's not super duper popular, in most places, that pass will get the whole car in. But there's a few other bonuses. If you have a fourth grader, your family gets a free pass for the year, or you can put in volunteer hours for a free annual pass. And anyone who has a permanent disability also qualifies for a free pass. Considering the price of movie tickets or admission to most major aquariums and zoos, this is a screaming deal. And they tend to be lighter on the gift shops. So this is a great year to go appreciate the historical and natural riches available in our national parks. It is also especially important to be thoughtful and take to heart the motto of take only pictures and leave only footprints. After all, some of the most earnest, thoughtful, and smart and conscientious people work and have worked at our national parks, but the last few months have absolutely shaken this unique system that truly makes our national lands the people's lands. So be extra kind, pick up after yourself, and maybe be willing to pick up after others as well. Maybe bring your own toilet paper? The facilities might be suffering, but what you're really there to see, the sky, the birds, the flowers, the trees, the rocks, the water, the view. And if you are quiet and still and patient and lucky, a whole zoo's worth of wild animals. Please remember these animals are wild. Don't approach them. Don't touch them. Don't feed them. That's the best way to end up as an embarrassing and viral TikTok. So to see what can no longer be seen anywhere else in America, that's what the parks offer, and once it's gone, it's truly gone. The first half of the early 19th century is when people really began to notice these changes, which is why it's important to bring up these spaces now. We've been making our human big changes to them for just about 300 years. That can feel like a long time, but compared to other places humans have been changing the world in big ways, it's a very short time. Which means we are lucky to have these pockets that allow us to peek into and ponder and recall America's history and the history of the land before the United States of America and Amerigo America as well. Because hard as it is to remember and comprehend sometimes, history is much longer and it is full of lost stories. So as the summer heat turns up, one thing to truly appreciate about many of our national parks is that many of them are cool. They're around bodies of water, rivers, lakes, waterfalls, and many are full of trees, creating shady places with breezes. So plan a trip to a cool, quiet place this summer in one of America's national parks. You can do your homework and plan a great trip on nps.gov and go meet some interesting people who treasure these places. The National Park Service staff. Episode 144, Early 19th Century Apples, the Fruits of Progress and Propaganda. Hello and welcome to the History of American Food. This week I'll be looking at how apples spread across America, how they played an important part in spreading American ways about thinking about land, wealth, expansion, ownership, dinner, dessert, education, and alcohol. For such a seemingly simple fruit, the apple has had an outsized role in shaping America. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that in the first half of the 19th century, apple production and consumption dwarfed every other fruit on American farms. It had taken root in culture and agriculture. By the time we get to the middle of the 19th century, it felt like apples took over almost overnight, but in reality, apples had been lining up to race across the country as American ambitions began to look ever further west since the middle of the 1700s. From its very birth, the idea of America has been very much more a hope, rooted in myth-making and idealism, than it ever was a realized thing. To paraphrase Neil Stephenson at his speculative sci-fi best, America has always been like a doll. We all want to dress up in our own emotional clothes. And when it comes to apples, this tendency is on full display. The avatars of the early 19th century American self-mythology were presented as fantastic stories that were everywhere in the popular culture of most of the 20th century. And just as the social media stars of today, the line between reality and comfortingly constructed fiction is blurred into near invisibility. When it came to clearing the forest for farming and making wood for construction, there was the first entirely fictional figure, the giant Paul Bunyan and his equally massive blue ox, Babe. The pioneers who followed on were kept safe by the exaggerated and tidied up exploits of the entirely real Davy Crockett. The railroad builders and thus America would have their also entirely real hero figure in John Henry and his steel-driving hammers. I must absolutely pause here to put it on the record. John Henry did, in some cases, beat the steam-driven hammer he races in the famous song that claims he died with a hammer in his hand. But he did not. I was shocked to learn a few years ago he did not die in that contest. Rather, it turned out that a dead John Henry made better ad copy. The second entirely fictional figure was Pecos Bill, who represented the wild, independent, gunslinging cowboy riding the range alone and facing and conquering the vagaries of the dry prairie and other wide-open spaces of the New Texas. And the last major avatar of early 19th century expansionism was one Johnny Appleseed. He represented the peaceful farmer bringing the cleared lands of the continent under the benevolent rule of the plow. John Chapman, later Johnny Appleseed, was also an entirely real man, but like Crockett and Henry, one who lived a mostly different life from the one that takes center stage in the mythology. I bring all of these men up because all of them were made a memorable part of my elementary school education through the medium of musical cartoon shorts. If you're interested, I have links to the Disney products and similar that were huge in this period in our self-mythologizing. But back to apples. While all of these guys were growing as American legendary figures, it's only John Chapman that figures directly in the complex story of early 19th century apples. Back when garden planting women first arrived as colonists, they brought seeds, and the resulting garden apples were of various flavors. But most of them were sour or bitter. See episodes 27 and 28 for more on these early apples and why they were like that. But these highly tannic apples meant very few were eaten fresh and raw, and if so, they weren't that enjoyable. Given the opinion many people had at the time of raw, fresh fruit, this wasn't much of a loss. Instead, apples were stored in barrels where they would cure and dehydrate a little, or were sliced and hung from rafters and around the fire to become the ubiquitous dried apple. But most apples would be squeezed for juice. that is, cider. And because pasteurization and refrigeration weren't things yet, that juice, or sweet cider, left to sit around would ferment, turning it into hard or alcoholic cider. And at around 5 to 8% alcohol, it was good for several weeks with a few months in a cool, dark place. Or it could be doped with apple brandy or other distilled alcohol to raise it up to a more stable 10 to 12% alcohol. Records from the end of the 18th century indicate that families went through 10 to 50 barrels of cider each year. And this huge cider output by all these new families on new farms would be part of the fight of the emerging temperance movement. When Carrie Nation eventually became the face of the prohibitionists and used a hatchet she was carrying around to bust up saloons, she had picked up the hatchet in the first place as a symbol of all of those cider trees littering the New West that needed to be chopped down. The hope was to stop the flow of cider that was sullying the soul of the nation. But for most people, the hard cider they were making was an important contribution to the calories they required to keep their farms running. And because nothing was wasted if they could help it, after making the cider, those squeezed apples, a substance called pomace, would in turn be added to pig feed. Though sometimes the crushed apples would first be combed for seeds. In fact, that was the source of the seeds John Chapman would carry as he moved from his very full family home in northwestern Pennsylvania, just under the New York border. Chapman came from a family where his mother gave birth to 2 living children and at least 2 infants that were dead at birth or soon after, the last of them taking her life. His stepmother then gave birth at least 15 times, though only 10 of them survived into childhood. Needless to say, it was crowded at home, and the local farms were just as crowded as well. This seems to have contributed to John's decision to strike out west for opportunities. At this point in American history, apples, the ones imported from Europe, not just the native crab apples, had been spreading out through the local tribes. Trails through the Allegheny Mountains, built and maintained by the locals, the native population crisscrossed the landscape. Like the Natchez Trace that I highlighted at the beginning of episode 102, these were fairly level and dry tracks that connected villages and kept the ramified trading network alive that caused things like jade carvings from Central America to be found up and down the Mississippi River and dotted around the East Coast. But in 1779, as part of the effort to clear out members of the Iroquois Confederacy that had allied with the British, some of this infrastructure was destroyed by the Sullivan-Clinton campaign into the Wyoming Valley that crosses the New York-Pennsylvania border. One result of this scorched earth campaign was to burn all the apple orchards the tribes had established. Following on, about 15 years later, John Chapman would use some of these abandoned trails and plant new apple seeds in those previously cleared orchards. Whether Chapman knew about the campaign is unlikely, information dispersion being what it was at the time. But the land across the Allegheny Mountains had been cleared of its previous inhabitants, opening it up for occupation by the newly minted Americans. And many of them were quite ready to pack up and leave. The best farmable land on the east side of the Appalachian Range and auxiliary ridges had been swooped up by wealthy large landowners. The less desirable edges had either been sold or claimed by people we now think of as the humble yeoman farmer, the ones that inhabited Thomas Jefferson's daydreams. But a few generations on, the land was being divided into smaller and smaller sections through inheritance, to the point where the divided plots of land could no longer support a family. The land across the Alleghenies and the Appalachians generally called, and people were in desperate enough spots to take the gamble. So how were people acquiring this land anyway? Upon the declaration that some new land now belonged to the new America, it would first be roughly surveyed by a combination of military and civilian surveyors. In order to fund the government, blocks of this land would be sold to rich men with money to spend, land speculators hoping to sell the land before the bill came due, and some was granted to veterans of the Revolutionary War and associated campaigns. And a little bit of it was sold directly to people hoping to set up their own farms. After too much disastrous absentee land ownership, rules were set up regarding habitation requirements. Someone had to actually be on the land, and it couldn't just sit there. It had to be improved. That is, a home had to be built on it, land had to be cleared, and have food of some sort grown on it, and some sort of orchard had to be established. And often the presence of apple trees was part of the requirement. Further south, peach trees were more popular, and pear and plum trees were also common. Ohio was one of the first of these land expansions, and it was to help these people occupying plots of land to aid in their dream of becoming landowners that led John Chapman, well on his way to becoming Johnny Appleseed, to start planting apple seedling nurseries. A few years ahead of the wave of emigrating Americans into Ohio on land he didn't own, or particularly have permission to be on, Chapman would set up a nursery with these seeds taken from crushed cider pomace. When people arrived 3 or so years later, they could be provided with sturdy 3-year-old seedlings that had survived things like deer browsing, winter snows, and the local summer heat. If it had made it through all that, more or less on its own, for Chapman did not tend his nurseries very much, they were a good candidate to grow well in the new area. But this set up an interesting contrast. The pioneer who was coming out with a good axe, a wife, a passel of children, and maybe an ox, would buy or often barter a sack of hickory or chestnuts, or maybe a deer haunch and some cornmeal, for a clutch of 3-year-old seedlings that would produce mysterious future apples. But for the already wealthy landowner who was moving west after their tobacco land had gone bust and it had been sold for dairy land, or had sent out a well-provisioned adult son to expand the family holdings, they arrived with wagon trains of supplies, oxen, horses, donkeys, and slaves, and apple tree suckers from proven cultivated varieties. Ohio, being a free state, meant that all enslaved people were declared free, though often as not the people themselves were unaware of this change in their station. Amongst all the equipment, plows and hoes and shovels and buckets, and the prodigious muscle power, was seed for grain crops and seed for garden crops, but notably not seed for apple trees. When a well-provisioned pioneer headed out to set up a new outpost, they brought apple tree suckers. What, you may ask, are suckers? Well, certain types of hardwood or deciduous trees have more than one way of spreading and propagating. Yes, by seeds, but they will also send out little shoots to start another trunk. These can be seen shooting out from the lower part of the trunk of the tree or from roots a little bit removed from the tree. And they're especially common on fruit trees and maple trees, especially after they have been trimmed or even cut down to the stump. In fact, when large trees are cut down, they must also be treated for suckers or they'll simply grow right back up. For the orchardist, it is important to go after these importuning, hopeful new branches after a pruning session, as they will take away nutrients you're hoping will go into making fruit later on. But for the person moving to a new spot, these suckers are the perfect thing for bringing along your favorite apple. Suckers, if cut correctly from their mother tree, and then the raw end protected, often by wrapping it in a wet scrap of cloth and dipping that in wax, these can be coaxed to root in the soil of their new home and grow into a new tree. This divide in what kind of tree new residents grew would do much to create something of a class gap in what kind of apples you grew. The chancy seedling apples from seeds that were only good for cider, or proven cultivars that could also be good for eating. Now, someone stuck with seedling trees might not have to be permanently relegated to bitter cider apples. Grafting was a well-known agricultural technology that was also moving through the new country. By well-known, I mean there is evidence of it being used in and around Mesopotamia and the Fertile Crescent as far back as 500 BCE. There are mentions of grafting wild olives with domesticated ones in the New Testament of the Bible. Rome, as a grape-growing power, had mastered the art of grapevine grafting. It is a simple technology that depends more on seasonal timing and technique with a grafting knife, rather than any special equipment or chemicals. Granted, there are chemicals that make it easier now, but they are merely helpful, not necessary. So, grafting. That's when a compatible rootstock or trunk of a tree has a slit cut into it, and a cutting, that is a small piece of branch or a sucker from the desired tree, is bound into the base material. The two pieces will join, and everything above that cut will be the new added plant. Everything below it will be the original plant. You can see this in action right now at your local home center or plant nursery. Most garden roses have the pretty part grafted onto sturdier rootstock. Look at the base. You can usually see the join. Same with a large number of the yard trees. Again, look down near the bottom and you will see a join somewhere close to the base. And this is absolutely how those advertised multi-fruit trees happen. If you ever see a tree offered that can produce 4 kinds of apples or cherries, apricots, peaches, and plums, grafting is how it was done. It's not scary magic, just practical. Do note that the trees do have to be very closely related. Apples won't grow on a stone fruit tree. Oranges won't grow on an apple tree. Oh, and just for fun, Amelia Simmons, that dessert-loving author of America's First Cookbook, she wasn't clear on this idea even then. She encouraged the planting of apple trees, sure, but said that a single tree could be used to host, quote, 12 or 14 kinds of fruits which might be engrafted. See, even here, America's early agricultural dreams always outran reality. Arborist tricks aside, what the grafting versus grown from seed divide really points out that already there were 2 distinct stories about land in America. The advertisement was that wealth in America was to be grown from the land, but the reality was that wealth was made selling land. And our John Chapman, as he grew older and truly transformed into the slightly wild man he would end up, proved this. He used the land to grow things, thus would never be rich. If you watched the short cartoon from the link in the show notes or read up on the legend that was built around him, you'll be told he was a lifelong vegetarian who never used gun nor hatchet, friends to all the animals and even to the Indians. Yet his own story is far more complex and messy. Like many an adventurer of his time, he traveled with both rifle and hatchet. There are even store records of him purchasing tobacco, ammunition, whiskey, sugar, chocolate, and belying his barefoot reputation, even several pairs of moccasins. For what it's worth, him going barefoot even during his travels during 3 seasons of the year would not have marked him out as particularly odd. Shoeless until frost and snow was the way of the world for the majority of Americans in the early 19th century. And there were many of the Seneca tribes, the locals to the part of Ohio Johnny was traveling in, who saw him as a harbinger of doomful things to come. Apple orchards and the companion European honeybees meant the force of the new American army would likely soon be applied to push the Seneca out of their own orchards and gardens and hunting grounds in favor of the expansionist Americans in search of new land. Once people did establish their orchards, some with proven tasty fruit and some with all manner of mystery apples, a few winners would emerge, and these would be spread about and grafted and planted from suckers. So many an orchard would produce those barrels and barrels of cider from cider apples, but a few trees would contain cooking apples and maybe even some dessert apples, the kind you could pleasurably eat right out of your hand. These were few and rightly prized. These would be cooked into pies and puddings and eaten fresh when they were at their best. We now look slightly askance at the tradition of bringing the teacher an apple, but when it becomes clear that a freshly picked apple that was a sweet treat to eat was a rare and coveted thing, it becomes much more clear. The example given about the relative value of apples that were good either raw or cooked versus other fruits in the history of John Chapman I've been reading was that sometimes peach-picking teenage boys were paid for a day's work with a bushel of apples. The peaches would have been juiced and made into peach brandy, and the apples would have a number of fates. And incidentally, paying and barter at this time in America, incredibly common. We were short on cash. Anyway, the tartest apples with the highest tannins, those were almost always sent to cider, and maybe to augment livestock feed. The next tier of apples were storing apples, too bitter to eat straight off the tree, With some storage or other treatment, they could become palatable. After all, other fruits popular in this age, like quince, persimmons, and medlar, were also aged after picking to make them tasty. So aging apples was hardly odd. If anything, it was almost the expected thing to do. In fact, it could be a relief. I mean, most of those apples were all coming off the tree at once. There was no way to eat them all. Some were stored whole in barrels in a dugout cellar, but a large number of those apples were processed for alternate storage. Dried apples in a few forms were a popular option. Cored and sliced, they were strung up to dry until they were shriveled and softened. But in this concentrated form, and lacking most of their water, they would last well through the winter. With the advent of the canning jar, thanks to the growth of glass manufacture, apple butter also started to become a more popular item. Apple butter is simply apple sauce cooked down until the fibers break down and dissolve and it becomes smooth, and much of the water is cooked out. This makes it a concentrated paste that is unwelcoming to the sorts of creepy crawlies that love to rot things. However, its concentrated sweetness would attract insects, mice, and rats if not sealed properly. So glass jars that could be capped either with paraffin or with lids, made a tighter seal than the pottery jars that were topped with waxed leather tied over the top. This changeover in technology was instrumental in making apple butter, and then later apple sauce, more popular. The dried apples would appear in things like apple tarts and pies, and even on the side for savory dishes. These days, the most famous savory combination barely lives on as pork chops and applesauce. But back in the oldest days, it was best known as snits and nip. Or to those of us not fluent in Pennsylvania Dutch, that is, the German dialect spoken by most of the Amish and other Anabaptists of Pennsylvania and surrounds, dried apples and dumplings. This was a typical winter dish as it required long stewing over a low fire and was a way to introduce a little sweetness into an otherwise drear winter menu. The dried apples would be soaked overnight and then stewed for several hours with either salt or smoked pork. Optional onions could also go into this stew. Modern recipes call for a bit of brown sugar and maybe even cinnamon to be added, but these would have been impossible luxuries on an 1815 Pennsylvania farm. When the apples and pork were cooked through and as tender as they were going to get, they were placed aside, and a simple dough made of flour and fat, with salt and maybe some dried herbs, was mixed up into a slightly sticky dough. The dough would then be roughly torn and boiled in the broth created by the pork and apples. Then the entire mixture would be served as a dumpling stew. Mustard and a variety of pickled vegetables would often accompany the central dish. The use of boiling water to cook apples reminds me that I must emphatically invite you to try apple dumplings. This fall dish has almost absolutely and entirely fallen out of favor as America became a country first of ovens and now fryers, both air and oil. We became a pie country, both pan pie and hand pie, and the apple pie left the apple dumpling in the dust. But during my entirely unnecessary trip to Romania last fall, I got to try a plum dumpling. The soft, sweet fruit inside, spiked with cinnamon and sugar, surrounded by a soft, fluffy dough was such a comforting bite. Romanian dumplings are made with a paste of potatoes and wheat flour. This is the secret to a fluffy, boiled dough rather than a gluey paste. So imagine my surprise when I discovered that Mary Randolph in her second edition of the Virginia Housewife included a recipe for apple dumplings that instructed the cook to make a mashed potato, flour, and water paste surrounding apple slices to make the fluffy apple dumpling. If you're interested in trying out this treat, look to Irina Georgescu's Romanian pastry cookbook, Tava. It has a recipe for the plum dumpling using a flour and potato casing. Then these are rolled in cinnamon, sugar, and butter breadcrumbs for an extra sweet crunch on the outside. Simply replace the plums with either 1/4 of a modern American apple or about a 1/3 cup of chopped apple. And choose a tart one with a close texture, or one of the new apple varieties like Opal or Ambrosia or Envy, or maybe the antique Winesap variety. That one can trace its antecedents to 18th century New Jersey, by the way. So as we look out over early 19th century America, filling up with pigs, being opened up with steel plows, invaded by cows, we cannot forget the apple trees. Johnny Appleseed made it as far as the swamp bottom area around Fort Wayne, making his total number of states 3: Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana. He definitely made it easier for the people establishing their farmsteads to set up their orchards. But apples were set up north and south of his reach by plenty of other people with homesteading on their minds. This also included the people on the Oregon Trail, setting up orchards in the rich river valleys of the Willamette and Columbia Rivers in future Oregon and Washington states. As much as grafted apples of proven tastiness were preferred, they were definitely more work to spread, and so the seedling apple is mostly what was planted as America spread west. This created a bit of a Cambrian explosion of apple varieties in America. By the middle of the 20th century, each county or town would have their local favorite. A survey of all the American apple varieties would turn up thousands. And these were just the varieties people kept. There were tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands more that simply arose and died out as too bitter or entirely unremarkable. But the legends people would tell of this odd little man, often with a philosophy book or religious tract of the Swedenborgians under his arm, planting trees and begging bed space caused every town with an old apple tree in it to claim a visit by Johnny Appleseed. Limited documentation then had similar effects as too much documentation does now. It was a ripe time for myths and legends to grow, and the figure of Johnny Appleseed scratched a particular itch. He could represent a peaceful yet inevitable occupation of the West, and its rightness could be proven with the literal fruits of his labor. So for next episode, since foraging time is opening up in America, I feel like it's worthwhile asking, what is America's problem with mushrooms? As more immigrants came over from Europe and started taking advantage of the vast riches of America's wildlands outside of the farms, there was a strange ambivalence to mushrooms. Thanks for listening. Any email questions or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episodes helps me know that you're out there, but even better than that are your reviews. If you let people know that you're listening and enjoying the show, you can spread the word. If you want more food and history in your future, let me know if you'd be interested in me including some interviews with modern people talking about how their projects connect to our food history past. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Insta, and elsewhere as @THOA Food. All this information is available in the show description.